over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, and I will do my very best to explain this in a straightforward manner as possible. But as I say, as you said, there are some technicalities, but I will do my very best to explain it in a straightforward way. And it also goes to Ricardo's point earlier about assessment literacy and trying to make sure that candidates are able to understand how we go about setting our pass mark and maintain standards. The focus here is on SQE1 rather than SQE2. The reason for that being is that the majority of the feedback that we do get from candidates and other stakeholders about wanting to understand a little bit more about our standards and our pass marks relates to SQE1. So that's why the focus is more on SQE1 in this section. The other thing to mention before I get into it is that we do use multiple papers for SQ1 in each delivery. And so when we talk about setting the pass mark is set independently for each of those papers. So it's important to flag that. And as Zoe mentioned earlier, the papers that we produce, we are aiming, of course, for them to be equally challenging, but it is inevitable that there will be some small variations in the difficulty of those papers. And that's where our approach comes in. So where we do have evidence that a particular paper is more difficult or easier than the others, the pass mark will be reflected to ensure that difficulty or easiness is ironed out. So we don't have a predetermined pass mark for our SQ1 papers. We don't use a historical precedent pass mark of, say, 50% that would apply to all the papers. That wouldn't represent a fair approach and not one that's in line with best practice either. So for SQ1, as I've mentioned, the pass mark is adjusted to reflect the difficulty of each of those papers.
Thanks, Tim. So that's the overview. So how exactly is the pass mark determined?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, so it's not a straightforward process. There are, because we are looking at the difficulty of each paper and setting the pass mark accordingly, there are a number of steps and processes that have to be undertaken to enable us to do that. The pass marks are determined in accordance with the standard setting and marking policy. So it makes sense when I go through how we determine the pass mark that we refer to the relevant parts of that policy. And as I said, I will be aiming to do this in as straightforward way as possible. So for SQ1, the policy is essentially split into two parts. So the first part deals with the candidate score. So that's paragraph 1.2 that we can see there. And this is relatively straightforward. So each correctly answered question will receive 1 mark. There's no negative marking, and so the number of marks that the candidate gets are added together to provide the overall score for that candidate for that particular assessment. So, for example, a candidate may get 114 questions correct out of the 180 available for a particular FLK assessment, and that's what we call the raw score. So the candidate does actually see that score on their results portal as well. So that's the candidate score. If we move on then to think about how the pass mark is determined, then so this is a little bit more involved. So I'll go through it in hopefully a methodical way. I should point out at the start that the pass mark that's considered by the assessment board and ultimately approved by the assessment board is presented as the number of correctly answered questions required to pass the assessment. So you can see on the slide there that we've got an example where pass mark may be 105 out of 180 correctly answered questions, and that's what would be required to pass. Scale scoring has already been touched upon, and I will mention this right at the end as well, but the pass mark presented to candidates will always be presented as a figure of 300, and I'll touch more on that right at the end of this particular session. So let's have a look through then and see how the pass mark is determined. So paragraph 1.3 of the policy refers to the fact that a cut score for an assessment will be determined by the assessment board, having reference to the standard determined by the modified AGOFF method, any other recognised standard setting methods as appropriate, as well as statistical equating. So we'll come back to the cut score a bit later on, but essentially what the cut score is it's referring to the lowest possible score to pass an assessment, so the lowest possible pass mark. As we'll see later on, that doesn't necessarily mean that that would be the actual pass mark, it's just that lowest possible pass mark. It's also probably important to mention at this point that the policy refers to more than one standard setting method. You can see that in those first two sub-bullets on the slide there. To date, the AGOFF method has been the primary standard setting method for SQE1. However, with any form of standard setting, it's essential each and every time to conduct an evaluation of the standard produced by that particular method each time it's used. So essentially what that means is we need to check that it's worked and produced a sensible and a reasonable result. And so it's unwise to restrict any assessment board to only being able to make a decision on a pass mark based on one method alone. So that approach hopefully makes sense, but it's certainly supported in the literature as being good practice. But it is the modified AGOFF method that's the primary underlying standard setting method used for SQE1.
So, Tim, given that AGOFF or modified AGOFF is so central to the way the pass mark is set, could you tell us a bit more about how that works?
Sure. So first and foremost, the key to any defensible and acceptable pass mark is the implementation of a very careful, systematic method that's based on research evidence and that's supported in literature as well. And so the AGOFF method is one, if not the most commonly used standard setting method for this type of assessment in a high stakes setting. And paragraph 1.4 of the policy gives a little bit more detail about how the AGOFF method works. If I could summarize, it involves, it's a legal assessment for prospective solicitors. So it involves a panel of qualified solicitors who are familiar with day one competence. And that panel considers for each question in an assessment, how many out of 10 just competent day one solicitors would answer the question correctly. So essentially that panel is looking at how difficult each of those questions are. The panel itself is carefully selected in terms of its diversity, and by that I mean in terms of the background of each individual panelist, their level of qualification. So we're keen to make sure we've got a real spread in terms of that level of qualification. Also in terms of practice area and in terms of whether the panelists are actually in practice. So some of them will be in practice, but some of them will be non-practicing. For example, they may well be in higher legal education. And the panel undergoes quite rigorous training before they submit their scores, so they're quite clear on the process and the task that they have to undertake. And so the panelists submit their scores and they're recorded, and there's an opportunity for discussion. So, for example, there may be a few panelists that provide much higher or much lower scores than the rest of the panel. And so there's an opportunity for everyone to discuss the different scoring, give the justification for that scoring, and if and only if the panelists deem it appropriate after that discussion, the opportunity to adjust their scores. And once they've put their scores in, the average score of each question is used, and then we'll see in a moment that that's used to determine what we refer to as the cut score. So you're going to see on the next slide here a small example as to how that method works. So this is a fictitious example. You can see on the left-hand side there, in the pink column, we've got 10 questions. So we can assume this is an assessment of 10 questions. And on the top there, you can see in blue, we've got 15 examiners. So these are our panelists from A through to O. And you can see what they've done here is that, let's take question 1, for example. Each of the panelists has given that question a score. So that's number out of 10, just competent day one solicitors, how many would get the question right. So for question 1, you can see the scores range from 1 through to 4. So the panel think question 1 is quite a difficult question. And that's reflected in the average or the mean score for that question. So if we keep going along to the right to the green section, you can see there's a column which is entitled mean, and the mean score for question 1 there is 2.3. So that's coming out as quite a difficult question. I won't go through each and every question, but question 2, you can see the mean score for that one is 6.5. So the panel have deemed that one not quite so difficult, slightly more on the easier side. And so that process goes on for all of the 10 questions for this particular assessment. And each of those questions then gets that average or mean score. And those mean scores are added together, divided by the number of questions, and then converted into a percentage in this case here. So you can see it, the little red box at the bottom there, that is what we have determined would be the cut score then for this assessment. expressed as a percentage. I did mention earlier on that the assessment board for SQE1 determines a pass mark, which is the number of correctly answered questions. So that percentage can easily be converted into that number of correctly answered questions. So that's the AGOFF panel and the process and how we get that cut score in a nutshell.
Thanks, Tim. And I think it's really important to everybody to take away that it is solicitors who are familiar with what is expected of a day one solicitor, and their level of competence that is at the heart of the standard setting process here. But the standard setting and marking policy also refers to statistical equating. Can you help with us an understanding of statistical equating and how it's used for SQE1, please, Tim?
Sure. Yeah, so you're quite right. Paragraph 1.3 there, which we've looked at earlier, also refers to statistical equating. And just to add, there's a further paragraph in the policy, it's paragraph 1.5, which also explains that the standard setting process, so the modified AGOFF method that we've just looked at, is repeated periodically. And in between times, the standard of the assessment is maintained using statistical equating. So it might be helpful for me to explain that in a little bit more detail. So essentially, once we have a pass mark set using the AGOFF method, we have what we might refer to as a base standard, a pass mark that's determined by that recognized standard setting method for each paper that's being delivered. But we don't necessarily need to conduct that AGOFF panel for each and every assessment, and that's where the statistical equating comes in. And what the equating allows for is that comparison of the difficulty of different assessments by considering how candidates perform on common or the same questions in those different assessments. So equating is actually quite a complex statistical procedure, but I'm going to attempt to explain the real basics of how equating works on the next slide. So here you can see we've got an example of two tests. We've got test A and test B. And those tests have a number of common questions. So each test has a proportion of questions that are the same. And then when they're delivered, you can see test A, the candidates score 50% on those common questions and have scored 55% on the other questions in that test. Then a different test, test B, we can see there that the candidates have also scored 50% on the common questions and have then scored 45% on the other non-common questions in that test. And so you can see that as the candidates for test A and test B have both scored 50% on those common questions, we can conclude that those candidates for each of those, taking each of those different tests, are of a very similar ability. But given the fact that the test B candidates have scored lower on the other questions in that test, we can conclude that test B is the more difficult test, and therefore what equating allows for is a lower pass mark to be set for test B. And so if you can maybe put this into a little bit more context, the pass mark set for test A could have been set using that underlying AGOFF method that I've talked through already. And then test B could take place at a later date, so maybe 6 months later, for example, as is the case with SQE1 assessment windows. And so the assessment board is able to use the equating as a method to ensure that the pass mark for test B not only reflects the difficulty of the paper, but also ensures that the standard is maintained over time. So in other words, it shouldn't matter to candidates which assessment they take, whether they take test A or test B, the overall level of performance required to pass each of those tests is the same. And that's what Zoe alluded to earlier on as well. And again, also mentioned earlier on was the relatively low pass rate for the July 2024 SQE1 assessments when compared to other windows. And hopefully this shows you that the approach that we can take, so that's being able to look at the performance on the common questions in different assessments by different assessment cohorts, allows for that direct comparison of the strength of those cohorts and assurances that the standards have been maintained. So in that example, the assessment board was able to conclude that for the July 2024 cohort, they scored lower on a set of common items. So they were ultimately of a slightly lower ability than the January 2024 cohort. And that would therefore account for that lower pass rate that we saw.
Thanks, Tim. So, I mean, there's quite a lot that's already happened, but I think there are a few more steps to go through and before the final pass mark is determined.
That's correct, Julia. Thank you. So there's certainly one final step that's taken before the pass mark is determined. So once we have the cut score, so a reminder, the cut score is the lowest possible score to pass an assessment. At that point, the precision of the assessment, which is measured by the standard error of measurement, is considered by the assessment board. So the standard error of measurement is another statistical term or concept, and essentially tells us how much a candidate's score might vary if they were to take the same test on multiple occasions. And so it accounts for variation in factors such as the candidate's performance on the day, the specific questions that are used in that specific assessment, and even other environmental factors. So, for example, what happens if the candidate had a particularly good night's sleep compared to usual the night before the assessment. And so because of that measurement error, a candidate's observed score, so that's the score that they would achieve in that test, in that assessment, might not perfectly reflect their actual true ability as a result of the variables that can impact a candidate's performance on any particular day. And so in high stakes professional assessment, the interests of the consumer, so in the case of the SQE, the consumer of legal services, they're paramount. It's the same in medicine, for example, so the interests of a patient would be paramount in the medical profession. So it's really important that that measurement error is taken into account when determining the pass mark. And so it's common in high stakes professional assessments that act as a gateway into a profession to add a multiple of the standard error of measurement to the cut score, which in turn then helps reduce the risk of incorrect pass-fail decisions. What it really does is it ensures that those achieving a pass mark are absolutely competent to practice. And so to summarise, the pass mark, which we've determined now, or the assessment board would have determined, is made up of that cut score plus a multiple of the standard error of measurement.
Thanks, Tim. And then once approved by the assessment board, the pass marks for each paper are presented to candidates as a score out of 300. This takes us back to scaled scores that we were talking about for SQE2 earlier. Can you explain that step for us, please?
Yes, I can. I'll do it briefly, but there is plenty more guidance on the SQE website in relation to scaled scoring. And there's a really, really useful YouTube video as well that can be found easily online. But essentially, as there are multiple SQE1 papers, as I mentioned earlier, in each delivery, and they may well vary slightly in difficulty, it's difficult for candidates to be able to properly compare their score that they've achieved with the rest of their cohort, whether that's the cohort that within that assessment window or whether it's comparing themselves against previous cohorts. So, for example, a score of 105 on a difficult paper is better than a score of 105 on an easier paper. And so to allow an accurate and fair comparison of scores, the process of scaling sets all the pass marks to a figure of 300, with candidates seeing their scores, their scaled score being out of a total of 500. And so in the example I just gave, the candidate who scored 105 on the more difficult paper would have a higher scaled score than the candidate who scored 105 on the easier paper.
Thanks, Tim. You've covered a lot there. As you've set out, there's a lot to setting the pass mark. And sometimes we hear from candidates complaints, if you like, or questions about why they can't know immediately they finish their exam whether they've passed or not. I'm hoping that Tim's explanation of the many steps that are gone through to make sure that a pass mark that is fair and reflects the level of competence that we're looking for involves many steps and takes some time, inevitably. And we can't take shortcuts on that.